Recently, I was lucky enough to go to Toulouse in southwestern France as the guest of the government of France and the cultural services of France, along with Camille Love, who's the director of the Office of Cultural Affairs here in Atlanta. Toulouse and Atlanta are sister cities. So there's a long connection actually going back to Maynard Jackson's when he was mayor. Toulouse, I believe, was the first sister city Atlanta ever had. Mayor Jackson was actually married in Toulouse in this beautiful 16th century city hall. His mother studied in Toulouse, so that was the origin of the first sister city relationship with Atlanta. So the purpose of the visit was to meet with artists and artist representatives to look at different people we could bring back to Atlanta to be part of an exchange program with Atlanta artists and artists from Toulouse. We've hosted a dance group for the last 2 years, and last year the company we hosted is led by a really dynamic choreographer named Pierre Regal, and his company did a very exciting performance with dancers who are technically not trained as dancers. Many of them were actually street dancers who he met, and they did a great performance here. He was so popular that we invited him back for this year. And so I got to meet him in Toulouse, and he'll actually be in Atlanta for about a week in residence, and he'll be working at the Goat Farm with Glow ATL. The company will be here, and they will perform on Sunday afternoon, October 28th, a new work called Standard, and it is using the hip-hop aesthetic to address some of the issues of modern day life. It's very, very full of technical surprises, and it's an exciting company, and it was great to actually meet Pierre because he wasn't able to come when the company came last year. We also got to meet with we visited art centers, a choreographic center, we met with representatives of the mayor, we met with people from the Cultural Services Council there, and of course the difference in Europe and here is that they're strongly committed to arts funding. And they have a wonderful series of support. They have a wonderful web of support for artists, performing artists, choreographers, creative people of all types. The French consulate here has sponsored a program, created a program called France Atlanta, and that's been very successful in the fall of every year. This fall will mark the 3rd anniversary of the France Atlanta program that's very heavily focused on science and medicine with some history and the arts included. Georgia Tech is a main partner, but Emory and of course Georgia State and the Rialto Center are also involved. The Rialto's been involved with France Atlanta since the first France Atlanta, and our role in it was to provide a home for and a presentation of French contemporary dance. They're a very leading edge country when it comes to what people think of as contemporary dance. And so we presented a work 2 years ago, and then this other work by Pierre Regal last year. So that's how we've been involved. The role of Georgia State has expanded as well. I believe the first year we were perhaps the only area of Georgia State that was involved. But now there are other areas who will be providing other programs during France Atlanta, so our role has expanded. What was really meaningful for me during the visit to Toulouse was not only, as I said before, the depth of support for artists, not just financial, but with physical structures and places for them to work and even live, but just the ambience of the city. It's a wonderful city built up in the 16th century. It's called the Rose City because it's full of red brick, and then when the sun sets, the whole city glows. The towers that you see are not the towers of skyscrapers, they're the towers of old churches. So you've got 3 beautiful Romanesque churches that are in the heart of the city. They haven't torn up streets to build highways. There are winding alleyways. The pace of the people is just marvelous. Everything closes from 1 to 2:30. They're very close to Spain, so they have the sort of Spanish, I think, way of life. And it was just a marvelous place to explore. So I think and so many people live there. It's very interesting to to talk to a lot of these artists and say, well, you know, we trained in Paris, but Paris is not the center of the world. And they have quite a few people moving to Toulouse. It's a very livable city on the Garonne River, and I can certainly understand why people would choose to be there. The sister city relationship would certainly have an influence on art and culture here because of one thing, their awareness of their own history and our awareness of our history. Obviously theirs goes back to 47 AD and ours is very recent, but I think that we are seen as a repository of very important history in the civil rights area and in social justice in Atlanta, and they also have their own sense of their history and have gone about preserving that history. The artistic exchanges are quite wonderful because they bring something to Atlanta that we don't have. So it's an opportunity for Atlanta artists to interact with artists from Toulouse and for them to experience Atlanta. And now what we're working on, of course, is sending Atlanta artists back because we have certain things that they don't have. That's a very American way of doing things, US-based, Southeast way of doing things that they'll be new to them. So for example, Camille and I got to meet with a couple of graffiti artists. Well, they're fabulous artists, but they're trained. In other words, they actually trained in art school, went and got graphic design training, but yet their choice of expression is through graffiti. And although they are commissioned all over the world to do murals, they've got shows in galleries in California, they still feel like they have to go out on the streets in the middle of the night and graffiti walls. And so that's their form of expression, yet they are not exactly like our graffiti artists. But what I think Camille is going to do is bring these artists together for dialogue, and it's going to be a really wonderful symbiotic relationship between the Atlanta-based artists and the Toulouse-based artists. One thing that France provides for their artists, and in Toulouse in particular, are facilities so that the work can be performed. And not just performed, but created. We actually visited a space that was a former factory that had been turned into a workspace for artists. So in that space they had animators, they had people doing stop motion animation. They had turned a whole area of what had been the factory into these stop motion spaces where people could work with this claymation and bring in the photography equipment. And they had actually made films and won awards for films that they've made there. But these are all young artists who are trying to hone their craft. They had a space for theater, a space where people could come in and just work on shows but not have to perform anything. They could just use it as a workspace to create what they wanted to do. We visited the workshop of a company called Le Fun, which I think means the fun, and the head of the program calls himself Ferrai, which means like blacksmith, because he works in ironwork, and he creates huge structures that do parades through the streets. So it was this enormous warehouse with all of this wonderful equipment and figures, and you could just imagine what goes on. And they create site-specific works that they create a story, and Camille is looking to bring them over here and create something that's very specific for Atlanta. So here we had this acres of space with dancers and theater people and filmmakers, and so it's a wonderful, wonderful symbiosis of all of these arts people getting to spend time together and work together and come up with things. And although they may not make a joint creation, they're all there together and they can all interact together. They can all hang out in a little kitchen together and spend time. And it was there were even people that had chosen to live in trailers on the site so that they could be close to their work. So it was a wonderful place that had been specifically supported by the government of the area and of the French government so that artists have a subsidized workspace. I think the most interesting part of the trip was that on the 4th of July, they had a ceremony in the city hall for the expatriate Americans, U.S. people that lived there. And after that, we were taken in the evening to a cultural center that is much like our community centers here, that was in a little suburb just outside of the city of Toulouse, where it's very heavily populated by immigrants. So there are refugee and immigrant populations, strongly Algerian and Somalian and Ethiopian and all sorts of people who have, for whatever reason, relocated or fled their own countries, and they've relocated into this suburb. This center on July 4th actually celebrates Martin Luther King and the whole civil rights movement. So they had a performance by a group it was basically Algerian, but there were lots of people integrated into it. So it started with a performance. There was an exhibition of civil rights memorabilia, and part of the exhibition was put together by residents out there. They talk about Gandhi, and they talk about Rosa Parks, and they talk about Mother Teresa, and they talk about peacemakers, but Martin Luther King is really a driving leader and inspiration to the people in this community center. And but July 4th is a special celebration, and so we were part of that celebration, and it was really moving and fun and interesting to just see how this population has basically embraced Martin Luther King and his life, and that's the touchstone for all of them.